All right, without further ado, we are going to bring Dr. John Eastman onto the show. Dr. Eastman, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be on your program, Liz.
Okay, Dr. Eastman, talk to me about this. You've been ringing the bell longer, I think, than anybody else that I can think of about the threat of nationwide injunctions. I will confess to you, I was not even as educated as I ought to have been about the authority of judges who are on any federal bench that is lower than the Supreme Court and whether they're actually allowed to issue those injunctions. But you argue that they are not.
Well, so here's the problem. The lower courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. They're limited by geography, the Western District of Washington or the District of Colorado. All have geographic limits, but they're also limited by the key provision in the Article 3, the judicial article of our Constitution, that they can only address cases or controversies. So they can't decide and impose obligations on people that are not parties to the case before them. So if the state of Washington sues Trump to block an executive order on birthright citizenship, for example, and the court determines that the order was illegal, then that would prohibit the president from implementing it against the state of Washington. But a nationwide injunction says, well, I think this is illegal, and therefore I'm going to ban you from fulfilling your executive duties throughout the country to people that are not parties to this case that I have no jurisdiction over. And that's the real significant violation. There's no longer a case or controversy between the president's executive order and people living in Rhode Island in that Washington state case. And yet this judge is issuing an order that affects the people in Rhode Island as well. You also end up with conflicting orders. One judge may uphold it and another judge issue a nationwide injunction saying you can't implement that executive order. That means the judge that said it was okay and perfectly constitutional has now just had his authority usurped by this single judge over in Seattle. So there are all sorts of problems with it. The Supreme Court has sent a couple of shots over the bow of these lower court judges over the last number of years, but they don't seem to have gotten the message that there's a problem with these nationwide injunctions. And what's happening right now is getting so out of control that I think the Supreme Court's going to very forcefully respond to it here in relatively short order.
Well, let me start there then and ask how that process would happen, how the Supreme Court would respond to that. Would Trump's Solicitor General have to get involved and ask the Supreme Court to respond, or did they just do that of their own volition?
No, the Supreme Court has to be asked. They can't just take a case because they want to. So in the Washington birthright citizenship case, for example, the Department of Justice have filed an emergency appeal of the preliminary injunction that was issued against their executive order, a nationwide injunction. That's now pending before the Ninth Circuit. Now, there are two routes open to the Department of Justice at this point. They can wait for rulings by the Ninth Circuit, and they can wait for rulings in other cases that are also making their way up and see if we get what's called a circuit split, with maybe the court in Atlanta disagrees with the court in San Francisco or something like that. But there's a little known provision of Supreme Court authority where the Department of Justice can ask the Supreme Court to weigh in even before those courts of appeals decide their case. And if they really want this thing resolved in an expedited way, I hope they're considering that option too.
And what would that option look like?
Well, they file what's called a petition for writ of certiorari in advance of judgment by the Court of Appeals. And it's like any other petition for writ of certiorari, except we don't have a judgment by the Court of Appeals all ready for them to be reviewing. They're just taking the case.
Do you expect the Trump Department of Justice to do that? Would you advise that they do that, or wait to see what the circuits rule?
Well, there's a lot of strategic thinking and timing. And do we want to wait, say, for the court down in Texas to weigh in upholding Trump's executive orders and then go against the Ninth Circuit out in San Francisco that's striking it down so that the court has the mix of different opinions? That's one way of thinking about it, and that's the normal way we think about these things. But the scope of these nationwide injunctions on almost all of the president's executive orders is really astounding. And I think they might well want to consider asking the Supreme Court to step in earlier. Because obviously what the game here is is to delay tactics. Let the clock run. Let's see if we can run it for the whole 2 years and get past the midterms and hopefully take over one of the branches of government in the midterms, or maybe run the clock for the whole 4 years. And that would essentially deprive the American people of the results of the election that they just consented to. That is a mandate to President Trump to do exactly the kind of things he's doing. And that's the other aspect of these judges weighing in and blocking the president's executive orders. The judges are like saying, well, we think that was an illegitimate election. The American people didn't know what they were doing. So we're going to stop the American people from exercising their sovereign power. That's essentially what's going on. And it is about as undemocratic a move as one can imagine.